Before sunrise on February 28th, the silence over Tehran shattered. At first, there were only a few distant flashes on the horizon. Then, the explosions began. Precision strikes tore into command compounds, security headquarters, and military facilities across Iran's capital. In the space of minutes, some of the most powerful figures in the country were dead. Among them was the man who had ruled Iran for more than 3 decades, Supreme Leader Ali Hosseini Khamenei. For years, analysts had debated what might happen if the United States or Israel ever attempted a direct strike against Iran's leadership. Many believed such an attack would trigger a war that could engulf the entire Middle East. Now that moment had arrived, but the operation itself was only the beginning. Because while the strikes demonstrated extraordinary military precision, they also unleashed a crisis that no one fully understood, and one that was about to send shockwaves far beyond Iran's borders. Within hours, missiles would begin flying across the Gulf. Energy infrastructure would come under attack, and the narrow waterways that carry a large share of the world's oil would suddenly feel dangerously exposed. What began before sunrise in Tehran was no longer just a military operation. It was the opening moment of a confrontation that could reshape the global energy system. The strikes that hit Iran that morning were not a single attack. They were part of a coordinated military operation planned weeks in advance. According to early reports, the United States and Israel had worked together to identify a list of high-value targets across the country. These included senior members of Iran's leadership, key security institutions, and facilities connected to the country's missile program. Shortly after dawn, waves of precision weapons began striking those locations almost simultaneously. Command centers were hit, military compounds were damaged, and parts of Iran's security establishment were caught completely off guard. For military planners in Washington and Tel Aviv, the operation demonstrated an extraordinary level of coordination and technical capability. The strikes appeared designed to cripple Iran's ability to project power beyond its borders and to disrupt the missile systems that have long formed the backbone of its regional deterrence. But as the first reports began to emerge, one question quickly surfaced. What exactly was the strategic objective? Some American officials spoke about eliminating Iran's missile capabilities. Others pointed to its nuclear ambitions or its support for regional proxy groups. At the same time, messages coming from Washington hinted at something even more ambitious: the possibility of forcing political change inside Iran itself. And that uncertainty about what the operation was ultimately meant to achieve would soon shape everything that followed. Among the targets struck in those first waves of attacks was one location unlike any other. A heavily guarded compound in Tehran, long believed to house the office and residence of Iran's supreme leader. For decades, Ayatollah Ali Hosseini Khamenei had been the most powerful figure in the Islamic Republic. Every major decision, military, political, or strategic, ultimately flowed through his authority. Since taking power in 1989, he had shaped Iran's regional ambitions, overseen its confrontation with the United States and Israel, and maintained the ideological foundation of the Iranian state. That morning, the compound was struck directly. Within hours, reports began circulating that the 86-year-old leader had been killed in the attack. Initial statements from Iranian officials were cautious, but soon afterward, Iranian state media confirmed the news. Ali Khamenei was dead. He had been killed during the opening phase of the joint American-Israeli operation targeting senior Iranian leadership. The significance of that moment was difficult to overstate. Khamenei was only the second supreme leader in the history of the Islamic Republic, and the central figure holding together Iran's political system for more than 3 decades. His authority extended above the president, the parliament, and even the military. Suddenly, that pillar of the state was gone. And with his death, one question immediately began to dominate the region, not simply how Iran would respond, but whether the Islamic Republic itself could survive the shock. Inside Iran, the reaction was immediate. Within hours of the first strikes, emergency meetings were underway across the country's military and political leadership. Surviving officials moved quickly to stabilize the system and demonstrate that the government was still functioning. President Masoud Pezeshkian and senior figures within the Iranian establishment announced the formation of a temporary leadership council to manage the transition until a new supreme leader could eventually be chosen. But even as those political steps were taking shape, the military response was already beginning. Iran's armed forces and the Revolutionary Guard began mobilizing missile units and air defense systems across the country. Satellite images and intelligence reports soon suggested that launch sites were being activated. Across the wider region, Allied militias and proxy forces also began preparing for action. Bases housing American troops went on high alert, air defenses across the Gulf were activated, and intelligence officials in several countries began warning that retaliatory strikes could come at any moment. The message coming from Tehran was unmistakable. The death of the supreme leader had not ended the conflict. If anything, it had just begun. The first retaliatory strikes did not take long. Only hours after the attacks inside Iran, missile alerts began sounding across parts of the Middle East. Radar systems tracked launches moving west and south toward locations hosting American forces and Allied military facilities. Iran's response was designed to send a clear signal. This was not going to remain a limited confrontation. Several U.S. bases across the region were placed under immediate threat. Air defense systems intercepted incoming missiles and drones, but the sheer scale of the launches quickly revealed Iran's strategy. Rather than concentrating on a single target, Tehran was spreading the pressure across the entire region. Installations connected to the United States were the primary focus. Military facilities, logistics hubs, and bases supporting American operations all became potential targets. But the retaliation did not stop there. Some of the strikes, or debris from intercepted missiles, began falling near civilian infrastructure. Airports were forced to suspend operations. Shipping ports moved into emergency procedures. Governments across the Gulf issued warnings to residents and activated emergency response systems. The conflict was no longer confined to Iran. Within the first day, the fighting had already spread across the wider Middle East. And as the missiles continued to fly, it became clear that the next stage of the conflict would place an entire region on edge. As Iran's retaliation expanded, the conflict quickly reached the countries surrounding the Persian Gulf. Missiles and drones began appearing over the airspace of several Gulf states, many of them aimed at locations connected to American military operations. These countries host some of the most important U.S. bases in the region, and they suddenly found themselves on the front line of a rapidly escalating confrontation. In Bahrain, barrages targeted areas near American and British military installations. Air defense systems intercepted many of the incoming weapons, but falling debris struck residential neighborhoods, damaging buildings and sending civilians rushing for shelter. In Kuwait, a base housing American forces was targeted by Iranian missiles. Again, defensive systems were activated, intercepting much of the attack before it could reach its target. Further south, the United Arab Emirates faced repeated drone incursions. Authorities reported hundreds of unmanned aircraft entering their airspace, forcing air defenses to engage continuously. Airports were temporarily disrupted, and several civilian areas were struck by debris from intercepted drones. Across the Gulf, the pattern was similar. Iranian officials insisted that their targets were military installations linked to the United States. But the geography of the region meant that many of those installations were located near major cities, commercial hubs, and civilian infrastructure. Airports, ports, hotels, and residential buildings all felt the effects of the attacks. For the governments of the Gulf states, the situation was deeply frustrating. Many of them had attempted to act as mediators between Iran and the West in previous crises. Now, despite those efforts, their territory had become part of the battlefield, and with each new wave of missiles and drones, the risk of a much wider regional war continued to grow. For decades, one rule had quietly shaped conflicts in the Middle East. Oil infrastructure was largely left alone. Even during periods of intense tension, most regional actors avoided directly targeting the facilities that keep the world's energy markets running. Refineries, export terminals, and major processing plants were considered too dangerous to strike. The consequences would be felt far beyond the battlefield. But in the days following the attacks on Iran, that long-standing restraint began to erode. One of the most alarming developments came when a major strike hit Saudi Arabia's Ras Tanura refinery, one of the largest and most important oil processing facilities in the world. Ras Tanura sits on the Persian Gulf Coast and Persian handles enormous volumes of crude oil every day. It is a critical hub in Saudi Arabia's energy system and a key point in the global oil supply chain. When reports emerged that the facility had been struck, energy markets reacted immediately. The significance was not only the damage itself, it was what the attack represented. If refineries and export terminals were now considered legitimate targets, the entire foundation of the global energy system had suddenly become far more vulnerable. For years, energy infrastructure had existed under an unspoken understanding that disrupting it would trigger consequences no one could control. Now that understanding was beginning to collapse, and once that barrier is broken, it becomes far easier for the conflict to escalate in ways that ripple far beyond the region. Because when energy infrastructure becomes part of the battlefield, the effects are never confined to the countries involved. They spread outward through markets, supply, chains, and economies around the world. At first glance, Iran's response might have seemed chaotic. Missiles launched across several countries, drones crossing multiple borders, energy facilities, military bases, and shipping routes suddenly under threat. But beneath that chaos was a clear strategic calculation. Iran understood that it could not defeat the United States and Israel in a direct military confrontation. The technological gap was simply too large. Instead, Tehran chose a different approach, one that focused on raising the cost of the war for everyone involved. Rather than concentrating its retaliation on a single battlefield, Iran expanded the conflict outward. American bases across the Gulf were targeted. Allied infrastructure came under pressure, and increasingly, the attacks began focusing on the region's most sensitive economic arteries, its energy facilities. The logic was straightforward. If Iran could threaten the flow of oil and gas that powers the global economy, the conflict would no longer remain a regional military confrontation. It would become a global economic crisis. Energy markets would react, governments around the world would feel the pressure, and countries dependent on Gulf energy supplies from Europe to Asia would suddenly have a powerful incentive to push for a ceasefire. In other words, Iran did not need to win the war on the battlefield. It only needed to make the war too expensive for everyone else to continue. As the regional situation deteriorated, new actors began entering the conflict. From Lebanon, Hezbollah launched attacks toward northern Israel, striking near the port city of Haifa. The group had long been Iran's most powerful regional ally, and its involvement signaled that the confrontation was no longer confined to Iran alone. Further south, another warning emerged. The Houthi movement in Yemen, closely aligned with Tehran, threatened to begin operations against shipping and regional targets as well. With Iranian forces retaliating, Gulf states under pressure, and proxy groups mobilizing across multiple fronts, the conflict was rapidly expanding beyond a single war. It was becoming a regional crisis, and at the center of that crisis lay a narrow stretch of water that carries a large share of the world's energy supply: the Strait of Hormuz. To understand why the conflict suddenly alarmed governments around the world, you have to look at a narrow stretch of water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, the strait is only about 21 miles wide. Yet through this thin corridor passes one of the largest concentrations of energy trade on Earth. Every single day, roughly 15 million barrels of crude oil move through these waters. Alongside that oil are millions more barrels of refined petroleum products. Tankers carrying gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel pass through the strait on their way to markets across Asia, Europe, and beyond. But oil is only part of the story. The Strait of Hormuz is also a critical route for liquefied natural gas, especially shipments coming from Qatar, one of the world's largest LNG exporters. Massive specialized carriers transport this gas across the strait before heading toward customers in countries such as China, India, South Korea, and Japan. In total, a significant share of the world's traded energy supply moves through this single passage, which means that even a small disruption can ripple across global markets. Shipping companies know this, energy traders know this, and military planners certainly know it as well. So when the conflict between Iran, the United States, and Israel began spreading across the Gulf, attention quickly turned to one critical question. What would happen if the Strait of Hormuz itself became part of the battlefield? It did not take long for the first signs of disruption to appear. Within days of the opening strikes, shipping traffic through the Gulf began to change. Tanker captains started receiving warnings from maritime security agencies about possible attacks in the region. Soon, those warnings became reality. Several oil tankers reported incidents while moving near the Strait of Hormuz. Some were struck by drones, others were damaged by explosions close to their hulls. Even vessels that avoided direct hits suddenly found themselves navigating one of the most dangerous shipping lanes in the world. The reaction from the shipping industry was immediate. Major carriers began suspending voyages through the strait, unwilling to expose crews and cargo to escalating risk. Insurance companies followed quickly behind them, raising premiums dramatically or canceling coverage for ships entering the area. Without insurance, most commercial vessels simply cannot operate. As a result, traffic through the Strait of Hormuz slowed sharply. Some tankers waited outside the Gulf, delaying departures while companies assessed the situation. Others attempted to reroute shipments where possible, although alternative routes were limited. For global energy markets, the implications were enormous. Oil production might still be flowing from wells across the region. But if tankers could not safely carry that oil to global markets, supply would begin tightening almost immediately. And as shipping slowed and uncertainty spread, energy traders around the world began reacting in the only way they could: by bidding prices higher. Financial markets reacted almost instantly. When trading opened after the first days of fighting, oil prices jumped sharply. Brent crude, the global benchmark used to price much of the world's oil, surged nearly $10 per barrel in a single trading session. That kind of move is rare. In the oil market, even a $2 or $3 change in one day can signal major geopolitical tension. A jump of nearly $10 immediately told traders that something far more serious was unfolding, and the rise did not happen in isolation. In the weeks leading up to the conflict, prices had already been climbing as protests and instability inside Iran raised concerns about regional security. By the time the strikes and retaliations began, oil had already gained close to $20 per barrel compared with earlier levels. But the real driver of the surge was uncertainty. Energy traders were asking a simple question: how long would the disruption last? If the attacks on shipping routes and energy infrastructure ended quickly, the price spike might fade just as fast. Markets had seen similar shocks before, brief moments of panic followed by rapid stabilization. But if the conflict continued, if tankers kept avoiding the Strait of Hormuz, or if key facilities across the Gulf suffered further damage, then the world could be facing a much more serious supply shock. And oil markets are extremely sensitive to that possibility, because when traders begin to believe that supply might disappear, even temporarily, prices can rise with astonishing speed. As shipping through the Strait of Hormuz became increasingly uncertain, major oil producers in the Gulf began activating emergency contingency plans. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates both possess infrastructure designed for exactly this kind of crisis, pipelines that allow oil to bypass the strait entirely. Saudi Arabia operates an east-to-west pipeline system that carries crude from its oil fields on the Persian Gulf coast across the country to export terminals on the Red Sea. From there, tankers can load oil without ever passing through the Strait of Hormuz. The United Arab Emirates has a similar route. Its pipeline runs from inland oil fields to the port of Fujairah, located on the Gulf of Oman, outside the narrow choke point where most shipping normally passes. In theory, these routes provide an alternative path to global markets. But there is a major limitation. Together, the two countries can reroute only about 5 million barrels of oil per day through these systems. That is a significant amount of energy. but it represents only a fraction of the total volume that normally flows through the Strait of Hormuz. Under normal conditions, nearly 15 million barrels of crude oil pass through the strait every single day, which means that even with emergency pipelines running at full capacity, most of the region's oil exports would still depend on the strait remaining open. In other words, these pipelines offered some relief, but they could not replace the strait itself. And as long as the conflict continued threatening that narrow passage of water, the world's energy supply would remain dangerously exposed. While oil markets were already reacting to the crisis, another shock was unfolding at the same time, one that received far less attention at first, but carried potentially even larger consequences. Natural gas. Within days of the conflict spreading across the region, global gas markets were suddenly facing three simultaneous disruptions. The first came from the Strait of Hormuz itself. Just like oil tankers, liquefied natural gas carriers must pass through the same narrow waterway to reach international markets. When shipping companies began suspending voyages through the strait, LNG shipments from the Gulf were immediately affected. And those shipments are enormous. A large share of the world's traded LNG, particularly exports from Qatar, one of the largest gas exporters on the planet, moves through the Strait of Hormuz before heading toward customers overseas. The second disruption came from Israel. As tensions escalated, Israel halted production at two of its major offshore gas fields, Karish and Leviathan. These fields supply natural gas to neighboring countries such as Egypt and Jordan, and the shutdown immediately reduced the amount of gas flowing into the regional market. But the third disruption involved Iran itself. Iran exports pipeline gas to Turkey, and those flows also came under threat as the conflict intensified. Even the possibility of disruption added further uncertainty to already fragile gas markets. Taken together, these three developments represented an enormous potential shock. If the disruptions were extended over the course of a year, they could affect roughly 130 billion cubic meters of natural gas supply, an amount equal to nearly 1/5 of global LNG trade. In energy markets, disruptions of that scale are almost unheard of, and because natural gas markets have been operating with extremely tight supply since the energy crises of recent years, there is very little spare capacity available to compensate, which means the adjustment would likely have to come from somewhere else, not supply. When disruptions hit global gas markets, the effects are rarely distributed evenly. And in this crisis, the first region to feel the pressure was Asia. That is because the overwhelming majority of liquefied natural gas passing through the Strait of Hormuz is destined for Asian economies. Countries such as China, India, Japan, and South Korea rely heavily on LNG imports from the Gulf to fuel power plants, factories, and urban energy systems. When shipments began slowing through the strait, buyers across Asia immediately faced the risk of tighter supplies. But one country stood out as particularly vulnerable: Pakistan. Unlike larger economies that import LNG from multiple regions, Pakistan receives most of its liquefied natural gas from producers in the Gulf. If those shipments are interrupted, even for a short period, the country has very limited alternatives. That means power generation can quickly come under pressure, industrial output can slow, and electricity shortages can spread through major cities. Across Asia, energy companies began scrambling to secure replacement cargoes wherever they could find them. But with global LNG supplies already tight, competition for those shipments was about to become intense. Europe, at first glance, appeared less directly exposed. Compared with Asia, European countries import a smaller share of their liquefied natural gas from the Gulf. Much of Europe's LNG supply arrives from the United States, Norway, and other producers outside the Middle East. But that did not mean Europe was safe from the shock. Global gas markets are tightly connected, and disruptions in one region quickly ripple outward. When Asian buyers begin scrambling for replacement cargoes, they often compete directly with European importers for the same shipments. And Europe entered this crisis in a vulnerable position. Gas storage levels across the continent were already unusually low for the time of year. With reserves limited, even a moderate surge in demand could send prices climbing. That is exactly what happened. Within hours of the first disruptions to LNG shipments through the Strait of Hormuz, European gas prices jumped sharply, rising by more than 20% in early trading. For governments across the continent, the message was clear. Even if the fighting remained thousands of kilometers away, the economic consequences would not stay there for long. Even with shipping disruptions and rising prices, there remained one scenario that energy markets feared above all others: damage to Qatar's LNG infrastructure. Qatar is not just another energy exporter. It is the second largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world, supplying enormous volumes of fuel to countries across Asia and Europe. Its massive liquefaction facilities along the Gulf Coast process gas from the North Field, one of the largest gas reserves on Earth, before loading it onto specialized carriers bound for global markets. If those facilities were forced offline, even temporarily, the consequences would be immediate. Dozens of LNG cargoes scheduled for export would vanish from the market. Countries already scrambling for replacement supplies would face even tighter competition, and prices could rise dramatically within days. For now, Qatar's facilities remained intact. But as the conflict spread across the Gulf and energy infrastructure increasingly became a target, the possibility of a strike against the world's most important LNG hub was no longer unthinkable. And that risk alone was enough to keep global energy markets on edge. Wars in the Middle East have shaken energy markets before, but for decades, one assumption quietly held the system together. Even during periods of intense conflict, the region's most critical energy infrastructure would remain largely off-limits. Oil fields, export terminals, gas processing plants, these facilities were understood to be too important, too interconnected with the global economy to become regular targets of war. That assumption is now under serious strain. In the days following the strikes on Iran and the retaliatory attacks that followed, energy facilities across the Gulf were no longer treated as untouchable assets. Refineries were struck, shipping routes were threatened, tankers hesitated to pass through one of the most important choke points in the world. And once that barrier is broken, it is difficult to rebuild. Energy markets operate on confidence as much as supply. Traders, governments, and companies all depend on the belief that critical routes will remain open and that the infrastructure behind them will remain secure. But this crisis has revealed just how fragile that system can be. Because when energy becomes part of the battlefield, the consequences spread far beyond the countries involved. They move through pipelines and shipping lanes, through financial markets and supply chains, touching economies on every continent. The conflict that began before sunrise in Tehran may eventually end, but the geopolitical landscape of global energy may not return to what it was before.